Hello, this Science of Sport video looks at BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and in particular part of the skeletal system, D5 joints. Now I've divided this joints topic into two parts, so this is the first of the two and looks at the classifications of joints. The specification actually just requires you to understand the different classifications of joints: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. And you might recognise at least one of those terms from GCSE or from your BTEC. So what is a joint in the first place? It's a place where two or more bones meet, and it's sometimes called an articulation. We've got articular cartilage, so joint cartilage on the ends of bones. We've got an articular capsule in some of the joints that we talk about. But basically it's where two or more bones meet. There may or may not be movement at this joint. So for example, some of the joints in the cranium, the skull bones join, but there's no movement between them. And we have, as an adult, about 350 joints. Joints are also designed in different locations in the body for different jobs. So this image on the right shows where joints are primarily designed to be for stability or designed for mobility, whether they're designed to be protectively strong and secure or for range of movement. Okay, so knees are more stability. If you think about the movements that happen through our legs, we want them to be stable so we don't damage them. Ankles have a lot of movement. Our shoulder joints, our hip joints have the largest range of movement, so they are designed for mobility. We want our lumbar vertebra to be very stable and protect not only our spinal cord, but obviously absorb a lot of shock and movement that occurs within our body. So it's a nice way of perhaps appreciating that different joints are designed for different functions, stability and or range of movement. And the three joint classifications, as you know, that we need to look at are fibrous, where there are no movement between the two bones; cartilaginous joints, where there's a little bit or slight movement between the two bones at the joint; or synovial classification, which are freely movable joint. So we'll look at each of those one at a time. First of all then, fibrous joints. So structurally, fibrous joints are bones that interlock or overlap between each other. There's no cavity, there's no joint cavity like some of the other joints have. And these two bones are connected by fibrous connective tissue. So it's a fused or fibrous joint. Fibrous connective tissue, and it's called a fibrous joint. So that's an easy way of remembering or making connection in your brain with the structure. It's fibrous connective tissue and it's called a fibrous joint. The reason it's so densely packed to fibrous connective tissue is we don't need or want any movement between these bones. It's structured for the job of being stable and strong and protective. Okay, so again, we obviously don't want these bones to come apart in any way. We need them to stay fused and together. So fibrous joints are also called fixed or immovable joints because they are fixed in place, there's no movement within them. Easiest example are the cranial bones, which function to collectively protect the brain. Okay, so they're fused together to create this big area of protective covering for our brain. Next then we have cartilaginous joints, and again there's a little bit of logic to the name. Cartilaginous because between the joints there is cartilage. So again, the easiest example is our vertebral column. So here you can see a vertebra. These two are cut in half, but between these vertebrae is a cartilaginous disc. So this is a joint, a cartilaginous joint, and the vertebral column is made up of lots of cartilaginous joints. So the structure of these is designed to be stabilized or held in place by lots of ligament. Again, other videos have shown all the ligaments that run up and down our vertebral column. And of course, as I've said already, there is a cartilage disc between the two bones, fibrocartilage. So again, your pubis, so these two pubic bones are joined by this cartilaginous joint, and that's fibrocartilage, fibrous cartilage. The job of this, particularly in the vertebral column, is to shock absorb. So again, if you think about jumping and landing, all the force that goes down through your vertebral column gets absorbed partly by these vertebral discs. If we just took this one joint here, this one pair of vertebra, this one cartilaginous joint, there's actually not lots of movement that can occur between them. However, if we took multiple vertebral columns, and you will obviously be aware that collectively the vertebral column can make your back, your spine, quite bendy. So individually, in this cartilaginous joint, there's only very little or slight range of movement, but we can incorporate a large range of movement with multiple cartilaginous joints. So the easiest one to remember is between two, as an example, is between two vertebrae in your vertebral column, or perhaps between the pubic bones. So the third and final classification of joint are synovial joints. Again, these you might be familiar with. There are 6 different types of synovial joint under this category. So classification kind of means like a category. So within the synovial joint category, we've got 6 types: hinge, ball and socket, condyloid, gliding, pivot, and saddle joint. And we're going to look at those in more detail in the part 2 video. But the structure of this classification involves a capsule, a joint capsule. And the next couple of slides will go into much more detail about this. These joints, these synovial joints, compared to the other 2 classifications, allow a much greater range of movement. So remember, we had fibrous, where there was no movement. We had cartilaginous, which had a little limited or slight movement between the bones of the joint. Synovial joints typically allow much more movement. Compared to the other 2, and particularly compared to fibrous, they're much less stable. And one thing perhaps it's good to recognize early on is that stability and range of movement are inversely proportional. Where you have greater range of movement, you often have less stability, and vice versa. So again, there are different types of joint which we'll look at in a moment. And these are just essential for so many of the sporting actions and skills that we perform. There are the different types. Again, you'll recognize these, but we'll look at those in video 2. Just before we get to part 2, let's look more closely at the structure of synovial joints, because they have common characteristics or common components. You'll need to be able to, so this is from the specification, you'll need to be able to describe what each of these are and the function that they have, the job that they do. So let's look at those more closely. So again, you'll recognize that I've divided this information into structure and function, and repeatedly you will see and you will understand that elements of our body, anatomical features of our body in different systems, so we're looking at the skeletal system right now, but in all the other systems, the way our body is designed and structured is linked to the job that it has to do. Structure is connected to function. So our joint capsule is this outer layer, you can just see it labeled there, but it's the outermost layer of a synovial joint. So this is a very sort of standard neutral diagram. It's not particularly of any one joint, it's a more generic diagram. But a joint capsule is a double layered connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, capsule, bag if you like. And what it does is it incorporates all the other stuff within our synovial joint. It's like an outer case that keeps everything in place inside this synovial joint. So it contains the contents of the synovial joint, and it helps to stabilize and protect the joint. So it's designed like that for that job. Then we've got articular cartilage. So on the ends of these bones at this articulation, at this joint, you can see the sort of slightly darker blue layer of articular cartilage. There's the label for it. So this hyaline cartilage goes over the ends of the bones, it's smooth and slippery, because when these bones move, what we don't want is them grating together. We want them to move effortlessly without doing any damage if they make contact with each other. So this smooth, slippery surface of the articular cartilage enables us to have ease of movement, reduce friction, and reduce wear and tear damage. Inside the articular capsule, the joint capsule, is a layer of membrane, and this is called synovial membrane. See, there's the label. It's the very dark line there. Synovial membrane basically is what lines the capsule but produces synovial fluid. So it's got a really important role of producing synovial fluid. And as you can see below, the synovial fluid is what is inside this capsule. So it fills the gap. And what it is a very thick, oily substance. If you think about it, if you've got a squeaky door, you put oil in the hinge and it allows that hinge and the movement to occur effortlessly and smoothly. And synovial fluid is basically the oil that you put in your capsule in this joint to enable movement between these two bones without them wearing and rubbing. So in a way, the articular cartilage and the synovial fluid are two really important ways in which we protect the bones and enable easy, efficient movement of our joints. The synovial fluid so lubricates the joints. That's a good word to learn. And actually what it also does is it provides some nutrition, some nutrients for the cartilage. We want to keep the cartilage on the end of our bones very healthy so that it doesn't degenerate or wear or break down, because if the articular cartilage wears away or is unhealthy or weak or thin, then we lose the protection on the ends of our bones and we could end up with arthritis, which is incredibly painful. So the synovial fluid lubricates the joint. It's the oil in the movement, but also it provides nutrients for the cartilage to keep the cartilage thick and healthy. We already know about ligaments. So ligaments are these tough but flexible bands of connective tissue that work around and sometimes inside the joint to stabilize the joint. They connect bone to bone. They hold the joint in place. Absolutely essential part of a joint. And then one thing you may not have heard about are things called bursa. Bursa are little sacs of synovial fluid, and they're often you can just about see a little bursa being identified there. And these are often in very specific places to provide extra protection. So if you've got a tendon running over a joint, there might be a bursa between the tendon and the bone underneath to give it some extra cushion to prevent when you move your joint and the tendon is moving, to prevent it wearing and rubbing and prevent friction. So bursa, think of them as little sacs of synovial fluid that will be found in joints in very specific locations to prevent friction. So I just want to finish by giving you a sense of some of the possible exam questions associated with this topic. So here's one from 2018, and it basically gives you a little bit of information to start off with. So it says there are 3 classifications of joint, which you know. Synovial and cartilaginous are 2 of these. So it's claimed 2, and pretty much what it then asks you to do is describe, using an example, the 3rd classification of joint. So what you need to recognize already is that if you don't use an example, you're going to lose marks, and it wants you to describe the other relating to that example. And it's identified there are 4 marks available for this answer. So before I show the mark scheme for that question, here's a student answer from their examination, and this was taken from the examiner's report for this paper, which I really urge you all to look at. It gives you massive clues into the way the examiners interpret student work and what the grades are for, how you get your points, and also how you miss your points. So this was a 4-mark answer. These got less. So if we look at this, first of all, it identifies the missing joint, the 3rd classification, and it's fixed joints, or fibrous joints would be even better. So you get a mark for that. It's given an example. It's then said The bones at this joint are unable to move at all, so there's no movement. So that's one function of that joint. That's 2 marks in the first sentence. Gives an example. So the cranium is an example of where you would find fibrous joints. And then lastly, it goes into more detail describing the role of the cranial bones or the fibrous joint classification in protection of the brain, which would have gained the 4th point. So again, please take time to look at the examiner's reports. They tell you a lot. So here's the mark scheme. It gives you a couple of different options because there's more than one example, of course. But there we go. Fibrous joint, cranium is the example, no movement, protection. Another example could be fibrous joint or fixed joint, pelvis, no movement, protection of the reproductive organs. Last one then, another type of exam question. Gives you a table, it gives you a little bit of information. So table 1 shows a classification of joint and an example. Complete the table by stating the other 2 classifications and giving examples. An easy 4 marks. That level of information is actually very simple.